This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. My guest today is Debra Lew, Executive Director of the Energy Systems Integration Group, or ESIG. Deb's going to describe the macrogrid initiative to interconnect the nation's segmented transmission regions, which could make electricity delivery more reliable and affordable. Deb began her over 3-decade career in energy with 18 years as senior engineer at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, now the National Laboratory of the Rockies, and then 4 years as a technical director with GE. Before becoming an independent consultant in 2019, and joining ESIG in 2020. She became ESIG's executive director in July 2024. So Deb, you and I first talked about this macrogrid concept in 2022 in the context of DOE's SEAM study and ESIG's macrogrid type proposal for a national transmission system. Can you tell us a little bit about how those two earlier concepts were similar and how were they different, if they were different?
Sure. First, thanks so much, Herman, for having me on. Really appreciative of the invitation. So the SEAM study that was led by Aaron Bloom at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, as you say today, it's the National Laboratory of the Rockies, that was based on analysis that Dale Osborne at MISO did that had examined stronger ties between the eastern and western interconnections. So it didn't include Texas. There were 3 scenarios. They were done at a high level, but it was a really path-breaking study because it got industry thinking about the value of crossing that big seam in our 2 grids that goes north-south through the middle of the country. And we knew from earlier studies like the NREL's, National Renewable Energy Laboratory's Western Wind and Solar Integration Study, that bigger grids are better when it comes to managing higher levels of variable wind and solar generation. So a stronger interconnection across these halves of the country, you could be tying, the huge wind in the middle of the country to the west. You could be tying the huge solar resource in the southwest to the east. You could be thinking about when you're hitting peak load on the eastern seaboard at 6 or 7 o'clock Eastern time, that's 3 or 4 o'clock Pacific time for a lot of the Southwest solar resource. All of that really inspired industry. And what ESIG did was to sort of take the next step and say, okay, what about including Texas? What about taking a national perspective? What about optimizing generation and transmission and applying the full transmission planning process to this macrogrid idea? So a lot of the studies tend to run production simulations, production cost models. What those do is they simulate operations of the system over a year. They look at how much fuel you save and therefore how much money you save and how much emissions you save, right? But a full transmission planning study is also going to look at N-1 contingencies, like what if a path goes out? They will ensure the system can, keep running if a tree branch takes out a line, right? A full transmission planning study is going to look at voltage stability, right? The ability to keep voltage stable and manage reactive power is really important. That's what led to Spain's blackout, the big blackout in the Iberian Peninsula last year.
Can I interrupt you? Can I
Sure.
interrupt you for just a second, Deb? You're describing now some of the things that ESIG considered that were not in the SEAM study. Is that correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay. Just for the fun of it, I've always wondered, N-1, does the N stand for normal operations minus 1 fault or something? What does the N stand for?
Oh, yeah, just sort of and it's just a variable, the number of elements that you've got, and you take 1 out. So whatever number you got,
Okay.
N is, and then
And
what
by the way,
happens if you take 1 out, or what happens if you take 2 out of commission,
right.
and you
But
keep going.
go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your thought. I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. Other things that we suggested needed to happen in a macrogrid study. We're looking at frequency stability, oscillations, looking at resilience with extreme weather events, looking at resource adequacy, the idea that you only have one outage on the bulk power system every 10 years. And that's a really important one because this is where large scale transmission really shines. Because when you have one part of the country, let's say the Midwest is really cold, they need power. Other parts of the country, the Southwest, the Southeast, the Northeast, may have excess power. And that's something that the NERC folks, the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, looked at in their interregional transfer capability study.
Hmm.
So a lot of these different pieces we suggested needed to be examined.
This seams study left a lot of those things out. And I've heard, by the way, I've heard someone else that I talked to on the podcast mention Dale Osborne, apparently a very pioneering thinker in this idea. Um, was it what was the seam study? Was it some sort of a mapping exercise or numerical exercise? What was it that ESIG was building on when it used the seam study? Because it must have been pretty important because I remember the administration at the time didn't really want to uh, make it known. It was sort of suppressed, if I recall correctly.
Um, I think there were some political sensitivities at the time, but um, I agree. What it really did was inspire us to think about connecting the Eastern and Western
Ah,
interconnections. And that's just something that I think most people never really thought about, right? We've got the East, we got the West, and we got Texas. And these are all, they are asynchronously connected. So if you want to connect them, you've got to do it through DC ties. And the connections are small and there aren't very many of them. And
right.
so if one of them ever needs help, the others can't help very much. So bringing up that idea was inspirational. And for us, we thought, hey, this is a great study. It was a really good start. I mean, what they did was a super good start. It's just that there's a lot more detail that needs to be discussed in terms of what it would really look like and how it would operate and how it would help with reliability.
Yeah, and I want to move to some questions about architecture and technology and so on. But just before we move, my understanding is that there are some connections between East and West, but you mentioned asynchronously. So both of them are 60 hertz, but the waves are not in sync. They're not synchronously affiliated. So they're not in those wave patterns are the same size, but not in sync. So if you tried to push something across that that difference, uh, it would cause a fault. Is that what would happen?
Uh, if you tried to connect those two, you'd probably run into some issues. I don't know of anyone who's tried to do this, but um, uh,
Goodness.
you're right. There would be some phase difference between the two systems. And so
Okay.
the way we do this is we have converters that convert the AC to DC, and then the DC line crosses the seam, and then another converter on the other side that converts the DC to AC. And that's what we've got going kind of up and down that east-west seam, and then also between the Eastern interconnection and Texas.
Okay. So and what these technologies synchronize those waves and okay. So let me move on. Because I remember when we talked about this, you mentioned that ESIG had created this looped circuit architecture that was, at the time, you said it was pretty important to making this reliable, to keeping the power flowing. Um, could you explain a little bit about that? And is that something that we still need to think about using that architecture if we were going to do a national transmission system today? And beyond that idea of a loop circuit architecture. What about other new technologies and concepts that need to be part of a microgrid now? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So, what's behind that looped architecture is this idea of redundancy. So,
Mm,
people need to understand that the transmission system is designed to be redundant, right? So, if a tree falls on part of a line and causes a fault, then you've got protection devices that open up on either side of that line to isolate that fault. And then power automatically gets rerouted around that fault. And you, as a customer, you never even notice this happening. This happens all the time, and none of us know or should know. Um, but you can imagine if I put in like a really big, fat, like an ultra high voltage, high capacity transmission line where I'm trying to connect a high wind area to a high load area, and there's fault on that line, then there's got to be some other pathway to provide that n minus one redundancy. So what can I do? I can put in two lines, right? So let's say I put in now two lines. I can run them both at half capacity. And then if one of them goes out, the remaining line takes the full loading. But now I'm only using those lines for half capacity. That's expensive. So
right.
there's this old rule of thumb called the rule of three, and it says that three lines provide this nice balance between the cost and the redundancy in case you have an outage. And the Bob Zavadil, who led that macrogrid report, he proposed this architecture so that there would be this redundancy. It would be a self-redundant architecture. And he suggested you want at least three HVDC terminals and at least three HVDC circuits in this loop, sort of the same rule of three. And again, the idea is that you're trying to balance cost against reliability. You could have more terminals, right? But then you get more cost. And there is a multi-terminal HVDC meshed grid in Zhongbei in China that's got four terminals. So,
Mm,
you can do that. But with respect to like what technologies um, make this more practical, so the first thing is, should it be DC or AC? You could have a macrogrid be DC or AC. And we were pointing
mm,
out there's a lot of advantages to DC. So HVDC, it takes up less space. And as you know, siting and permitting anything these days in the United
right.
States is a challenge. DC power is controllable, right? So um, you should think about a DC line. It's like a pipe, and with water flowing in it, right? So power would be, that water flowing through that pipe, whereas AC power goes wherever it wants to go. It goes wherever the least impedance path, the least resistance path is, right? It'd be like having a plate with trying to flow water on a plate because the water is going to go where it wants to go. So the nice thing about DC is you could build it over the AC grid and control where you want the power to go and not mess with, you know, potentially causing constraints where people, operators on the AC grid might not want their system to be congested. And then also we have new technologies of HVDC. So the old technology is a line commutator converter that requires a lot of reactive power that doesn't work well in weak grids. The new technology is voltage source converters. They can control reactive power, they can support weak grids, they can black start. So we've got that. And then another new technology is multi-terminal DC. So the idea here is that the conventional way is point-to-point DC. And, that's great. Let's say I just want to send power from one point to another. But let's say I want to send power from this wind area to the eastern seaboard, but I want to have some offtake in Ohio or Illinois. And so you can add additional terminals for those offtakes. And again, the Chinese are leading the world in this. They've got a bunch of these multi-terminal HVDC. They've got an 800 kilovolt multi-terminal HVDC that's like 8 gigawatts of capacity connecting the area around Hong Kong to this big hydro in the west. So that's something that the rest of us are looking towards. Other technologies, I'd say around DC breakers, that's another uh, potential barrier that was an issue. So the idea here is if you think about those protection devices that have to open up to isolate the fault, with an AC breaker, it's easier because AC is a sine wave and there's a point in time when that current goes through a zero. And that's a nice way to extinguish your fault current. But DC is, you know, doesn't go through zero. So it's a lot harder, especially if you've got, 20,000 amps going through this. So
Right.
that's an issue, but we are developing higher power DC breakers. So that technology is getting better as well. So there's a lot of good developments happening.
Well, you mentioned China. We had former FERC chair John Wellinghoff on the pod, and he was describing the fact that China has something like, I don't know, 3,000-mile direct current, high voltage direct current line that it's already got in place and is serving the entire nation, and we're stumbling along. Um, so we don't, we're not doing what really is possible. I think that's something that was implicit in some of the things you were mentioning. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. It used to be, I actually used to work in China a long time ago. I
Hmm.
used to do a lot of work in China, helping to advance renewable energy there. And it was a lot of, the US was helping China. I think today the tables may have turned. What they've done in terms of, again, multi-terminal, the ultra high voltage, you know, the their technologies are really quite advanced. So
And the other thing that I want to emphasize, and tell me if I'm oversimplifying, but it sounds to me like this concept of a macro grid, its time has come. We have the technologies that everybody knows will work to make it a reliable source of electricity. Is that true? Am I getting it? I'm oversimplifying, but it seems like it's a valid oversimplification.
So we have the technology. Some of it is depending on which way you want to go, and if we're doing point to point, we can do that today. If we're doing multi-terminal, that has been demonstrated in multiple places. I mean, it is new, but it has been done in multiple places. So yes, we could do it. So some of this stuff is, it's newer.
Yeah. Okay. Another big topic, two subjects. First, what can you tell us about the potential costs and benefits of a microgrid? And the second subject that I'd like you to address is barriers. I've heard people talk about financial self-interest of incumbent transmission providers as a barrier to the development of an interconnected system, whether it's interregional, even regional. But what other barriers too? So costs and benefits first, and then barriers to this wonderful idea of interconnecting the nation's resources.
So probably the best study that's been done is by DOE, Department of Energy, and they built on our USEG macrogrid report, the NREL SEAM study report, and other people's work. Patrick Brown at MIT, Vibrant Clean Energy also did great work. And DOE built on all of this and executed the National Transmission Planning Study, and that's probably the best place to look at for quantifying costs and benefits because it was done at a much deeper level than all those other studies I just rattled off. So, so in that study, they co-optimized generation and transmission across the US. They looked at the robustness of scenarios. They translated the zonal results down to a nodal level. They simulated operations of the system. They quantified economic benefits. They costed out the system. They ran contingency analysis. They did extreme weather stress tests. And what they found is that, as you and I are aware, large scale transmission helps you save money. Yes, you spend money, but in the
Yeah.
end, you save more than you spend. So it helps you save money. It helps the grid be more reliable. It helps the grid be resilient in extreme weather events. It enables clean energy, but you need to significantly expand transmission. So what they find is that the total transmission doubles by 2050 and the interregional transmission. So they don't really call it macrogrid. They look at interregional, regional, and local transmission. So I'm using interregional transmission here as a proxy for macrogrid. But the interregional transmission ends up being like, depending on the scenario, 2 to 3.5 times bigger than what it is today by 2050.
Wow.
And they've got the most detailed cost estimates. So save a huge amount of money by building fewer power plants. So what they find is that for every dollar you spend on transmission, you save 1.6 to $1.8 on other costs.
Mm.
And I should also point out that number, right? The $1 trillion of transmission infrastructure, that's not macrogrid, that's all the transmission. So most of that cost is local transmission, and then another significant amount is regional transmission. The interregional piece, so what I would call macrogrid piece, is really pretty small. So that interregional piece, there's hardly anything in 2030. By 2040, it's something like $5 billion a year. By 2050, it's something like $12 billion a year. It's much smaller. So the other thing to note is that transmission costs, when you look at the whole scenario, right, in order to provide clean, reliable, affordable energy, you got generation, transmission, distribution costs, and transmission tends to be the smallest one, much smaller than generation and distribution infrastructure. I guess regarding your other question about
The barriers, yeah.
the barriers. All right, so um, you've got things like trying to align the self-interests of the different entities out there with the interests of the system and society and ratepayers, right? That's
Mm.
something I
Yeah.
think policymakers and regulators, to me, that's what their job is. Right, transmission is always a little difficult, right? Because if I'm an expensive generator and I've got this captive load, then that's great for me. But once someone builds transmission so that load can get to a cheaper generator, that's bad for me. So trying to line up, my self-interest with, these ratepayer self-interests, that's something that as something policymakers and regulators really need to work on. I would say there is progress on regional transmission because our RTOs and ISOs, they have the responsibility, right? They have the ability to take action there and to do something. But we don't have like a super RTO, right? We don't have someone who's got the purview and the responsibility for the whole country, whose responsibility is to plan and to build and to do cost allocation for the whole country, right? In Europe, they've got ENTSO-E. They can do planning across the continent. We don't have that. So that's a huge barrier in my mind for the US.
And it's interesting because my reporting has shown that even within the regions where there is some jurisdiction, there's a lot of contention, a lot of barriers to building transmission. Uh, and the policymakers really struggle. MISO has had this group of people from the states and MISO stakeholders, and they've worked really hard, and it's taken years to do this planning. So, and that's just a smaller group. So now, if you're trying to figure out how to get all of the states to cooperate, or a whole wide range of states to cooperate, it would probably multiply the challenges and for the policymakers. And it might be, I don't know where to take that thought without, maligning some representative or something. So but what I want to ask you is, am I right to assume that this challenge for policymakers is quite difficult?
It is difficult, and there's a lot of thorny issues, when you start talking anything about that who has jurisdiction, FERC over the states and states' rights, and those kinds of questions are always really thorny.
And they're going
Um,
to come up in this proceeding too. So something may flip right at, I should say we're recording this on January 9th. Um, it- the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is considering this large load proceeding that was presented to it by the Department of Energy, Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright. A lot of that debate is going to be between the states and the national interest, right?
right. Should FERC have jurisdiction over these large loads when traditionally states have had jurisdiction over demand? And so it throws up a lot of thorny and politically sensitive questions. Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcast's Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.